Assuming our sound is fine, I welcome you to another Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. Today we are playing Street Fighter Alpha 4, as you can see by the characters that are available on screen. Today we are looking at Rose, who has, of course, dropped and already had at least 2-3 hours of bot work. Prototype, I guess, is ready, but we're not certain enough yet. You might get a tweet tonight, you might not. In fact, this is going to be a large part of my data gathering to decide whether or not the prototype is ready enough. That said, our current Rose player has had some time with the character and has had some time against the bot to understand some things. The connection between these two, for some reason, despite the stations being so close to each other geographically, is somehow never good, so you can expect a little bit of lagginess for a bit. But not really of the type that's going to bother them too much. Usually it's more so that the entire thing just completely collapses and you don't get to do anything. And there's some stutter that is literal rollback. What you see, so now.
Round 2. Fight.
Another reason why we don't subscribe to most of the things people believe about this game is netcode. Not that it can't be super weird and sometimes terrible, it's more so that the explanations don't make as much sense as you think. So, JustVine has probably the most to work on today, kind of why we started this way. And we may be dropping to back so that she gets to play it more. But it does depend on the players in question. For example, Kansuki Dynasty, our Karin, has already had at least half an hour, if not an hour, practice with our Rosebot prototype, and has a fairly good idea of where she's going to stand. Oh, they're actually considered the royal family.
Round 1. Fight.
We were having some previous discussions about how the bot would be designed. A lot of it was going to depend on which strengths of Soul Spark were going to be required, which forms of Soul Reflect were going to be required, and all of that was shifted away when we found out how the new Soul Spark differences worked, and the fact there is no Soul Reflect, at least not as other than the V-reversal form that you've just seen. But with some additional things that came up, it looks like the bot required even more work. So, still working through all of the little kinks we could get that way.
Round 2. Fight.
We were concerned for a while that JustVine would not be able to play this character. After all, the ways that they could possibly have designed Rose in this game could definitely lead to a confusing and difficult character that doesn't quite match her style. It looks like we got almost exactly the opposite, so she can, in fact, play Rose relatively consistently with her standard patient methods.
You must be careful. This is your fate.
The main difficulty being having to work out how exactly to make use of the Air Soul Spark. This is something very useful in this matchup because you generally want to neutral jump against Karin on nearly every character in the first place. But you kind of have to read that Karin is coming to you before this is a good idea. Well, this somewhat removes that problem. If you don't think she is going to, if you press neutral jumping and think, oh wait, she's not actually going to attack, then you can quickly do Soul Spark to fill the space and still get something off it. Karin of course has counters, she has options to this, but compared to her normal solutions to people neutral jumping, especially zoners, they're pretty weak. So Rose has a lot more options in this space, so far as it seems, than most characters. Her consistent ability to play footsies by using max range Soul Spiral and other trickery also seems to be helping quite heavily with this matchup. So the main thing that's probably going to be holding her back here is day one unfamiliarity and whatever it is that causes these two stations to not want to sync up. But let's pause up a moment and see if we can get some other people into position.
Let's do this.
Well, we're not expecting Omni Rabbit, but we do have the Lara game to think about, which puts us on step 1 of this. Also something that for Omni Rabbit to check on later, probably. This is kind of hard from the Lara side based on what I have extrapolated so far, because the max range Soul Spiral is so strong against this character. However, of course, Rose doesn't really have a lot of really great ways to deal with Clap other than, once again, neutral jumping and throwing Fireball. But her back dash and forward dash are both good enough, and Slide will get her through it. She just can't do that much after. So her main goals would be figuring out how to keep the opponent off her long enough to not have to deal with it. You'd be thinking to yourself, well, she should just use the Soul Punish, but actually this isn't going to work out that well. Lara can armor through it, she can get around it, and she has a lot of ways of reaching Rose, which, unlike many of these other forms of the attacks, does instantly get rid of it. Like, Minak can throw an orb, get hit, leave the orb there, and if somehow it got into that situation, still explode it. Rose not only does not control when the Soul Punish explodes, she also doesn't get an explosion if she gets hit at all. But there you can see she has some good spaces where she can protect herself using various options. And there you want what you have the other side, block strings. Lara doesn't have really good answers to Rose block strings other than to armor through them. And Rose gets such big damage if she decides, I'm stopping this block string halfway, and then you can try other stuff. That is probably easy enough once you've gotten used to it. But, as I've always told the team, when you're first learning a strategy, learn why it doesn't work. Abuse it as much as possible for a short time. Because unlike other tactics where you are looking for something that you know works and only using that, the point here is more so, how many different ways can I hit this attack? Which ones of them get me killed and which ones don't? So, if she gets the chance, JustVine's probably just going to have to hit Soul Spiral constantly. Because as you can see, Lara has ways through and around Soul Spark, but much less around the Spiral. The fact that this move is a knockdown, and a pretty far enough away knockdown at that, makes Laura's life quite hard. And the projectile invincibility on EX Soul Spiral also helps you deal with that if your opponent is really insistent about using it to shield themselves. You can take sort of the trade and push them off. Looks like it probably became laggy, but really for a moment. That's some nice long range. Satellite is a more helpful and consistent method of dealing with this matchup, as it will protect you from more things Lara does, and help with offense a bit more. But it looks like our Karin gets her chance to play a relatively familiar matchup.
Let's do this.
I'm probably not going to have a lot to say about this one, so you can assume it'll be quiet for a bit, since I don't actually plan to discuss Rose information until a little later in the stream. We did start late today. That was oddly not because I was working on Rosebot at the time. But I'm not going to go turning this into a guidance stream by talking about all of the inputs and so on. Again, we're not completely sure. We're still gathering data about what exactly the bot should be doing in particular matchups, in particular spaces, and developing the variants. So,
I'll show you the divide in our class.
Round one.
we're going to be working hard here with our Rose player to see what we can get tested.
Round two. Fight. You lose. Round one. Fight.
that you have some skill.
Round 2. Fight. Final round. Fight.
Here we go. One more down. Not done yet. Keep going. Here I go. Bring it up. I'm gonna attack. Here I go.
You lose. Let's do this.
That's how you start the fight and finish it quickly.
This match is one we don't actually get to see at this level per se that often. Our Laura has a very specific way of playing that isn't quite this high octane. Probably due to being like exposed constantly to people who, as we've often mentioned, more so wait for one to make mistakes than anything else. But at this level of play, it's easier on Laura, and many people give the character a bad representation because of it. It's easier to just do as many things as possible and hope that your opponent doesn't know how to defend them all. So this is actually probably good practice for DWuulfe, as it's much closer to, okay, well now I'm getting to learn all of the stuff I don't normally learn because I play against a more sedate, controlled player of the same character. Our Laura bot does a decent job of this. She wasn't a terribly difficult character to make a bot for. But that is to say that the bot's purpose is what you see in the basically bronze up to top of silver range, i.e. you build bots mostly with their primary purpose to be teaching players who don't necessarily know all the matchup stuff how to deal with all the people who might not know the matchup stuff that well themselves, but have found starter strategies and will repeat them until they win. This is often why our bots don't generally look like they are useful to high-level players, because they're not for matchups when it comes to any higher level player picking one up. And you're going to see the same thing in our Rose bot. Rose at high level is not likely to be anywhere similar to Rose at lower level, And our goal therefore is to sort of work out what roles at lower level must do or must look like. If we see roles players today in the lounge, we'll probably be gathering some data from there too. But we don't need them today, as we are still probably working through the prototypes variants, as she is definitely a character who should have some slight changes depending on whether or not you, the player, tend to play in a zoning style or a close-in style. Since she has a specific input, specifically your first input, where you can make some variation in order to shift her to also the way you need her. Unfortunately, it's not super easy to change, so if you've decided to try to change your style or have an account that multiple people use, fortunately Street Fighter does also not care about that across systems, and everyone on a specific PlayStation that plays the game can have their own versions of bots. You can upload them however you want as well, which can be helpful for other reasons if you've got like siblings or family or anyone else in your household that has a different version of the bot but still has your character available. Maybe because you play a character that is standardly available, or they bought them for some reason, probably to play against you. It means that with their permission you can probably grab some practice time against a different version of the same bot. We may see some of that on us as well, but since we're also at the phase of bot development where re-inputting the inputs often to see what happens when that's perfect is going to be important, that may take up more of our time as well. You can probably therefore more so expect the prototype to be available tomorrow, even though I really wanted to make it today. There's just not quite enough information yet. If that changes between now and end of stream, because it really could, then we'll probably make it available on our Twitter at that point. And you can attempt to input it and let it start to teach you little things. The CPU version is decent right now, but she seems to fight a little simplistically. So it's hard to say if you can get the maximum out of it. We're still gathering data on that too, of course. I believe those uses of ether might end up being a really unfortunate outcome for the end, but hopefully not. There we go. Decent conditioning there.
Necalli wins.
Which leads us into our third match.
Round one. Fight.
Necalli doesn't so much need to neutral jump Lara as other characters do. Good jump art, good pushback, and the ability to go through flat when it's only lightly charged means that Necalli doesn't need to play the same sort of footsie-ish neutral that requires the neutral. And there's that move. Necalli's capacity to reach that far also really helps because you can't necessarily charge the back of Lara either.
Round 2. Fight.
There we go. That's more so what I expected to see. Lara can get a lot of mileage out of just doing her like ult instead. And Necalli's reactions to this move from that bottom will tend to be a lot harder to actually do. I'm gonna have to check if something's up with that before. Definitely unlike this player to just throw out that EX move repeatedly, so maybe something's up.
Final round. Fight.
Still cannot actually decide or predict the trajectory of this match, whether or not we're going to see Rose versus Lara or Rose versus Necalli next. Today's lounge is, as always, more or less an Atlantic Rim lounge. If you're anywhere along the coast of the Atlantic Ocean, expect that if your internet connection is good, probably your connection does. Maybe not stellar, but good enough you could get any information you wanted or practice properly. With practice and being off today though, we are expecting to see less people in the lounge. Somewhat.
Lara wins.
And of course we have no issue with players changing their character manually, but it is important in this case for people to know what they're going up against beforehand. Looks like we're back to Rose versus Lara.
Let's do this.
One of the difficulties of playing a new character when you understand the game too well in the mid-level is just not going into it with preconceptions about how your character's stuff works. And one of the worst things for this is to get into a really spacing dependent character and start by reading their frame data. Frame data is super important for many reasons, but characters like Rose, Chun-Li, even Cammy, it's not actually always telling you anything. For example, if you get the information, this move is negative,
Round 1.
you might think, well, I shouldn't use it, but then you have to think, wait, how negative? How hard are we talking here? What spacing can I use this move at? Because certain moves can put you so far away that the amount by which they're negative isn't actually a danger to you. Yeah, this is going to be hard because, again, our Rose player is conditioned to play footsies, and you don't really play footsies against Lara. You jump and use Soul Spiral. Nothing else is actually required at this level whatsoever, because Lara doesn't have any tools whatsoever that deals with any of it. The Soul Spark itself is not even that helpful because she will go through that most of the time, and you're mostly just risking it. Similar to how when you're playing Chun-Li, you just don't throw Kikoken against this character. It doesn't get you anything in most situations, so just don't do it. But it looks like JustVine is going to be working a while for getting used to the Soul Spiral max range.
You should try to learn to use your power.
Fortunately, it seems that the Lara player is aggressive enough that actually playing footsies and not just Soul Spiraling constantly is kind of still working. The consistency of this knockdown helps mainly because Lara has to clear so much space to get back to Rose. Now, you'd think, well, that's no use if I can't throw Soul Spark as a result of it. But you can always neutral jump, and as we mentioned before, neutral jumping against Lara isn't quite as strong as neutral jumping against Karin, but it's up there, it's fairly good, because she must dash and then do her stand medium punch as the anti-air, and get this all done in time. If she's far enough away though, you can just neutral jump after the Soul Spiral knockdown and throw the air Soul Spark, which is actually worth throwing. Whereas right now, JustVine is basically wasting time throwing Soul Sparks on the ground, because the opponent will outmaneuver them, and not necessarily not take damage, but change the spacings of the match to spacings she doesn't want. Air Soul Spark is a fairly good lockdown option, to the point where we've actually made the bot about dealing with the lockdown it offers. It also changes the situation because the opponent does not know whether or not Rose is jumping with her fairly long jumping kicks, or jumping to throw down Soul Spark at them. So it's good that she creates this much distance by doing basic stuff. Interestingly, the problem she might have, in the end, is that Rose is not required to be defensive, whereas JustVine tends to be defensive enough for that to be part of the rhythm problem here. We were expecting kind of a problem in the opposite direction, that Rose would have to play so actively defense that our player who likes to passively defend more often would have problems, but it looks like she might be the other way around. Most of this is therefore about positioning. Can I get to my spot? And is there anything whatsoever that happens that prevents me from playing that part of the game?
Lara wins. It's go time. Let's do this.
That is a weird mental reaction to have. I don't think of someone picking this stage as necessarily bad for them. Like, it could just happen randomly, I guess, if you forgot to turn it off or something. But for some reason, the fraud detection warning from Dive Kick starts playing in my head when someone does it. Weird, huh?
Round two. Fight. Necalli wins. Round one. Fight. Round two. Fight. Lara wins.
What a win for it. What even Lara? Anyway, I can also see why this stage is a problem, because you can't see clap sometimes.
Fight!
Even more good reason to ban this in tournament play, because you really... There are definitely timings where you can't see clap at all.
Round 2. Fight! Final round. Fight! Lara wins. Let's do this. Round 1. Fight!
This is your fate.
Round 2. Fight! Lara wins. Round 1. Fight!
Right there! Sword spot! This is your fate. Sword satellite!
Therefore, as we mentioned before, as a role player, your goal is generally to remove Lara's freedom of movement, more so than to move yourself. One of the things that's difficult in this matchup is knowing when you should dash forward to chase your opponent, and when you should just hang out at the other end of the screen and throw Air Soul Spark at them. Because it isn't that you should definitely just always do one of those things. But in general, on the knockdowns you are getting from the Soul Spiral, you generally just want to shoot. Again, this is because Lara has to cover more space, and you want Lara to cover the maximum amount of space so you can mess with her as much as you possibly can. Throwing grounded Soul Sparks doesn't usually work because the Soul Spark is actually fairly slow relative to a lot of other projectiles of the same type, and therefore your opponent will most likely jump over it. Rose doesn't easily deal with that space perfectly every time, and if there's any counter zoning tools whatsoever, you generally won't get very far. That, for example, was a good example of knowing your opponent is desperate enough that you can do something other than like try to get into the air or something. This comes up fairly often if you've been frustrating your opponent with a specific tactic for long enough, but you have a secondary tactic ready. You can just, when you have advantage, figure, okay, I think I'm going to do this now because you're just about frustrated enough that you're going to try to get around what I'm normally doing. The problem here is that this matchup requires a decent amount of meter up, given that you really don't want to be messing with Lara's claps too much in the mid-range, simply because of the relatively longer Soul Spark timings and so on. Once JustVine is a little bit more used to her target combo, I expect this to go very differently because Lara technically gets fully punished when she does the overhead, but I'm not actually sure what happens here because the game might treat her as still crouching and cause the second hit of the target combo to whiff. In which case, one will have to come up with something even more devious than that to deal with it.
It's go time. Let's do this.
show you the divide in our class.
Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight!
This is another one of those fairly layered matches where it looks like
Final round.
the main thing that's making the decision of winning in this match is who thinks it's their turn, and various other heavily layered combinations of that. For example, does the Lara think that it is their turn? Do they think that Karin believes it's their turn? Do they in turn believe that it is Karin's turn? And so on. This matchup actually doesn't usually go like this because both of these characters have fairly strong passes that hurt each other heavily by neutral jumping out of any attack that comes forward. Oddly, this leads to a much more sedate game a lot of the time, but when the rhythm speeds up, both people tend to get pulled along into it. It often requires a conscious decision by one of them to not only slow it down, but to do so in ways that force the other player to slow down as well. And you kind of have to project an aura of this or your opponent will just generally ignore you because they're more so still in the mindset of thinking about whose turn it is and not whether or not the match speed is wrong. If they continue to win with the high octane version of their flow, there's really no reason to stop it because the more they do it, the more stressful it is for the defender. And you definitely can get quite a lot of benefit from stressing the defending player in that way. Especially if you're creative enough with your offense, as this player definitely seems to have in their arsenal. They are just quote-unquote random enough to be doubly effective. And by random in this case, I mean the really strong, useful type of random. The type of random that comes in the middle of pressure strings and block strings. Because if you do the same pressure string every time, as DWuulfe, for example, constantly warns you, you're just going to get predicted. Knowing when to shift that and get something else out of it is really important. Unfortunately, Karin is no stranger to the high octane game. Can keep up with the best of them.
You win.
But by pushing it this way, you can at least somewhat shift things in your favor if you're playing a character like Lara, because it generally causes Karin to lose a lot of her stronger powers. Her footsies goes away in ways that force you to have to defend more, but you're defending against more predictable things, and when the Karin player makes an error, she does not have a lot of very plus moves. To the point where she has specifically a way for you to be able to punish her crouching kick if you're in the wrong position. If you were in the right position, your position is the one we're talking about as right here. When she does it, It's -4, you can get things off this. Lara in particular gets 1 or 2 good options to restart her offense in those situations. We've often talked about the natural winner of interactions, which also favored Lara in this matchup. If neither player makes, strictly speaking, any mistakes and just often move at the same time in neutral, Lara tends to win most interactions. Not only does she win more interactions, she also does more damage. Mainly because Karin must use meter to get hers, and Lara basically doesn't have to. It is a Win 10 Battle Lounge matches week. I'm not sure if they got all 10 of theirs, but they certainly seem to be heading out. Bringing us back to main team at about the halfway point of our stream. Necalli is another slightly problematic character for Rose because you have Soul Spark and he has Disguidance. The situation does not favor her main strategy, at least as most people understand that main strategy. Soul Satellite is also, therefore, not going to help a whole lot. And her main benefit here is that she has her back heavy kick, which is not quite a counter to Necalli, as you have to work quite hard, but combinations of back heavy kick, forward heavy kick, and jumps, yes, jumps, because that is how you deal with Necalli when you think he's going to come forward at you, can get Rose into position. And if you don't understand much about this character, having never played Alpha 2, back then Rose was basically famous for having a very dangerous and basically suppressive stand medium punch and crouch medium punch. And I'll let you know now, Capcom's trying to keep it a secret by changing the animations, but they're just as bad. Might be worse actually, not sure. Basically, Rose gets to hit those buttons for free in nearly every situation at close range. And the pushback on them is... I'm not sure if it's different than it was back in those days, but it's definitely bad. Bad for the defending player, that is. So, yeah, she just gets to do stuff. That required a whole meter to get out of, because he was already in free trigger. And honestly, there's not many other ways out of that. If you are not familiar, Rose can keep that going for a really long time and it be a true block string, so... I guess he could have just uppercut instead, but maybe he was trying to... Rose will take some damage, both when you get it wrong and in other flows. But, again, remember that all these things are not in... There you go, for example. These things are generally not in a vacuum. Being able to do this more against this character means that you will occasionally get to hit Soul Spark. Because Necalli can't afford to sit quietly and charge and wait for you to do Soul Spark, because you're not going to do it, you're going to hit a bunch of kicks. But every time you see him walk forward, but he started too far away, then you can Soul Spark. Not to mention the fact this move crush counters hits from forever damage distance, and you just don't really have any options from the other side. That's why you don't do that way. Rose has a lot of moves that have pushback that will prevent a lot of different punishes from working. If you're playing characters like Sagat or Abigail or whatever, you play your normal game. But all of us short button people have to care because even Karin finds herself sometimes in spaces where Rose has been too far away for anything to actually hit. The bot is actually kind of focused around teaching you these spaces when it's not, you know, throwing soul sparks at you. It is also why it's a harder bot to design and input than most, since so much of the game that it's trying to play is about being precisely in X position. And dropped. I think that the first V trigger might be the better one for this matchup. However, I have seen and based something off a specific combo that probably, if you go do a lot of Twitter stuff, you'll know it already, but for those who don't and are just looking through stuff, Rose can apparently do EX Soul Spark into a V cancel, dash, and then do the back heavy kick repeatedly, as in she can just juggle you across the screen with the correct timing of back heavy kick. So there is a benefit to using Soul Illusion here. You just have to be able to confirm your V-Trigger cancel off of your EX Soul Spark, which is not terribly difficult to do against Necalli because it's the only Soul Spark you can safely throw. Another decent way to deal with this character, if you're trying to play footsies for too long, is to take advantage of the fact that Necalli actually doesn't have a lot of moves that reach a very specific space, and therefore you can hit with a light soul punish sometimes. You can backdash into it too. Beyond that, a good max range sweep will get you very far as well. But it has to be absolute max range because, yes, Necalli can punish it. And will often be ready to punish it if you're not hitting enough other stuff to bait Necalli into doing other things in it, which is precisely why you end up using the Soul Punish. The main hard part to get used to, I believe, is the fact that none of the actual attacks Rose uses in the neutral are meant to get you more damage after hitting them. Basically, every time you hit that heavy kick, either forward or back, you should more or less fire and forget. You hit the move to put Necalli where you want Necalli to be, not necessarily because you can get any damage after it. So think of it as just a basic frustration option. Or if you play another character that has good footsies, whatever button it is you hit that's only there to keep your opponent from coming closer to you. Because that's where the jump comes in. Once you've got to the point of, I've frustrated you, I know you want to walk forward or jump or dash or attack me somehow, then Rose just jumps. The problem is usually solved.
Rose wins. It's go time. Let's do this.
fate? You shall know.
I'll show you the divide in our class.
Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight!
In this matchup, based on my understanding of the hitboxes, Rose finds herself in the opposite situation. She can't use the kicks. The way that they interact with Karin's moves tend to disadvantage her a lot. She can use her basic stand heavy kick as you've just seen, if she thinks Karin is coming forward, and she can use her stand heavy punch, which is really nice for the basic damage. Karin can jump against this stand heavy punch if you try to abuse it too much. But you really should just go with it regardless. That's an interesting choice for the Hanged Man.
Round one. Fight!
But as you've seen there, the move is actually just fast enough that if you didn't jump because you thought Rose was going to throw it out, you might not get there in time. She might block it. It's basically among the best stand heavy punches in the game, with the main problem being that it's super easy to whiff punish. So you must always have your spacing right. Fortunately for Rose, the spacing that Karin considers optimal is the one you want to be at. So you just move to there and figure, is she gonna, like, attempt to jump on me because she thinks I'm going to heavy punch? Or should I hit the heavy punch? You don't really need other buttons either, because, again, it's a range thing. You're better off, actually, for your own safety, moving to that spot, not hitting anything, and expecting to need to end here. Karin doesn't benefit enough from the damage or position and every time you throw out the heavy punch but Karin has used her good walk speed to move out of the spot, you get whiff punished. While it's not necessarily a huge amount of damage, it's meaningful. But you get to play a very relaxed game in this situation. You just don't have to hit the punch. You can just stand there and occupy space menacingly. Slight walk backs also lead to you having whiff punishes of your own. So, really it comes down to the Karin's player's ability to convince you that she's going to hit buttons when she isn't.
You should try to learn.
Final round.
But Rose tends to deal fairly well with Karin just wiggling around in neutral. Because again, she can neutral jump, and you're all relaxed about that too. But from the Karin side, we see something that is a nice and useful tactic against this sort of character. It doesn't come up that often, unless you're fighting someone in high silver normally, versus where most people learn this tactic. But your general goal is to get close enough to the character to try a neutral jump after a safe move. The reason for this is fairly Easy to understand, but hard to explain, oddly. When you've got yourself up directly in front of your opponent's face at -2, you have 2 frames of disadvantage. Your opponent can't throw you if you neutral jump. Technically they can do it anyway, but you get the idea. You get to jump, and you probably also could just block. If you do just block, then they don't always get what they want. Sometimes, depending on the character's options for pushback strings, they might not have a sequence of normal attacks that will actually put you where they would prefer you to be. Which means that for you, you got in, you dealt no damage, you block until they push you back out, but you still are sort of in a better situation. You're closer to where you want to be than they are. Which means they have to take the tiniest amount of time to move around, whereas you probably don't. Karin benefits from this a decent amount in this matchup, so getting in with her various -2 moves works well here, similar to how it does against G. This works really well against a Rose who doesn't understand that she shouldn't throw Soul Sparks, because it's fairly easy for Karin to get around those in multiple ways. So Orochi, as a main example, will get in, and Rose's pushback strings, while quite good, and actually really disadvantageous to most characters, don't tend to bother Karin very much. She still has the reach, she could still do a ton of things, and she still has Maokin if you really want to try that dance at that range and go for something.
Final round.
She can even charge the Maokin to end up advantaged enough to get something she wants and still build up more V-meter amidst all of that. Fortunately for Rose, Karin is squishy and Rose does a lot of damage. That's going to be one of the biggest problems in this matchup for the Karin player at any given time. Karin constantly puts herself in situations where Rose has the options for damage, compared to most other characters where, you know, it doesn't come up that often. And Rose is a character that can take most of your health very fast. That said, this is literally day 1, as in, I guess if you count certain things, no, I don't think so. I think everyone is on day 1 Rose. You couldn't possibly say that you have more. Now, some people have made a different use of their day 1, you know, not done work or recovered from a COVID vaccine, and therefore spent most of their day grinding combos and other things, but it's still day 1 Rose.
It's go time. Let's do this.
I'll show you the divide in our class.
Round 1. Fight. Round 2. Fight! Final round. Fight! You win! Round 1. Fight!
We're going to be ending this stream fairly early. This is probably the last on-stream match of the night. Because we do have to go out there into the wild and get as much wild rose research done as possible. Nothing has changed since the beginning of stream to make me particularly confident in the prototype. And therefore you can check it out tomorrow instead. By then I feel I should have something. But as it stands now, the one I have, I only have confidence that it works on one type of character. So, I will not be throwing out my own wild variant with that intention at the moment, until we have clearer data. You can probably expect to find that prototype at our Twitter 2_K_FGC, and most likely, for the sake of simplicity, it'll probably be done around stream time tomorrow, even though we won't necessarily be streaming anything. Other bots can as always be found at 2-mk.org, but Rosebot herself is unlikely to be on the site before Saturday, because even with the amount of testing we possibly could get done, we usually like to give it a week before something, in case there are any bugs in the character, weird exploits found, structural issues, and just to have enough time to collect all of the data from all of the people who could possibly play her. But at that point you will be able to find it at 2-mk.org under bots, SFC-bots, those two are the same. Or just typing in 2-mk.org/rosebot and it will take you straight there. This is likely to be around 7 PM Eastern on Sunday.
Fight.
Possibly before that, depending on other obligations. I expect this one to be full of nuance. One thing that did follow through from the stream we did have that mentioned this is that, yeah, a lot of her inputs are kind of long. And the ones that aren't tend to be high density, as in you do have to do a lot of things in order to make them work properly. But we basically come to the end of our stream for tonight. And the lounge will not necessarily be continuing either. Rather, we're going to go split up into other stuff and see what we can get in terms of experience through finding other lounges to poke at. So, you might see us in one of yours, but we're not likely to have our own open.
You win.
So Team 2MK is really bids you a good night and hopes you have good luck with your training.